A shy poor girl fears she's not enough for her millionaire doctor. But love proves her wrong when he chooses her over everything. Clara Evans sat in the waiting room of Evergreen Women's Clinic, her hands shaking. She held a clipboard with a form she needed to fill out, but her fingers wouldn't stop trembling. The room was clean and bright, with soft chairs and quiet music playing. It was supposed to feel calm, but Clara's stomach twisted with nerves. She didn't want to be here. She had never visited a gynecologist before, and the thought of it made her heart pound. For weeks she had felt unwell, tired, achy, and strange. At first she ignored it. She didn't have money for doctors and she hated asking for help. Clara lived in a small, cramped apartment, working long hours at a bookstore to pay her bills. She was poor and she knew it. But the discomfort wouldn't go away. Late at night she searched her symptoms online, and the scary words she read, cancer, infection, pushed her to finally come here. She couldn't put it off anymore. Clara looked down at the form. Name, Clara Evans. Date of birth, April 12, 1998. Medical history. She didn't know what to write. She wiped her sweaty hands on her old jeans and tried to focus. Her short brown hair fell into her eyes and she pushed it back nervously. She felt out of place in this fancy clinic. Everyone else looked so put together and she was just, Claire. Clara Evans? A nurse called. Clara jumped a little. Her heart raced as she stood up, gripping the clipboard like it could protect her. She followed the nurse down a hallway. The air smelled clean like medicine, and the white walls made her feel small. The nurse smiled and pointed to a room. Have a seat. Dr. Carter will be in soon. Clara nodded and sat on a chair inside. The room was neat, with a desk, certificates on the wall, and an exam table that made her stomach flip. She didn't want to look at it. She stared at her hands instead, twisting them together. She told herself to stay calm. Just tell the doctor what's wrong. Get it over with. Then the door opened and Clara forgot how to breathe. Dr. Ethan Carter walked in. He wasn't what she expected. She had pictured an old, serious man in a white coat. But Dr. Carter was young, maybe 30, with dark hair and bright green eyes. He was tall and handsome, like someone from a movie. His smile was warm and his clothes looked expensive. Clara's mouth went dry. This couldn't be her doctor. Miss Evans, he said. His voice was smooth and kind. He closed the door and sat across from her, holding her file. I'm Dr. Carter. First time here? Clara nodded fast, her cheeks turning red. She couldn't speak. He was too good-looking, too perfect. She felt small and messy next to him. I know it's scary, he said gently. But don't worry. We'll go slow. You're safe here. Clara swallowed hard. His kindness made her feel worse. She wasn't used to people being nice to her, not people like him. She didn't know it yet, but Dr. Carter wasn't just a doctor. He was a millionaire. And this visit was about to change her life. Clara couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Ethan Carter after her visit to Evergreen Women's Clinic. His green eyes and warm smile stayed in her mind, but so did her embarrassment. She felt silly for being so nervous around him. He was just a doctor doing his job. Still, something about him felt different, too perfect, too out of reach. She pushed the thoughts away and tried to focus on her normal life. A few days later, Clara was scrolling on her phone during a break at the bookstore. She typed Dr. Ethan Carter into the search bar, just curious. What she found made her heart drop. Articles popped up with big headlines: Millionaire Doctor expands Evergreen Medical Network, and Ethan Carter, the young genius of women's health. There were pictures of him in fancy suits standing outside huge hospitals he owned. He wasn't just a doctor. He was rich, famous, and powerful. Clara stared at her cracked phone screen, her stomach sinking. She lived in a tiny apartment with leaky pipes. He probably lived in a mansion. They weren't the same at all. She felt stupid now. She had sat in his office, sweaty and shy, while he was this big success. Her old jeans and shaky voice replayed in her head. He must have thought she was pathetic. Clara decided then she'd never go back to that clinic. She didn't belong there. But life had other plans. One morning, Clara went to a small cafe near her apartment. It was her quiet spot, where she could sip cheap coffee and read. She sat by the window, a book open in front of her, when the door chimed. She looked up and froze. Dr. Ethan Carter walked in, wearing a dark jacket and looking just as handsome as before. He saw her and smiled. Clara, he said, walking over. Didn't expect to see you here. Clara's face burned. Hi, she mumbled, staring at her coffee. She wanted to disappear. Ethan didn't leave. Instead, he sat down across from her. Mind if I join you? I come here sometimes. It's peaceful. She nodded, too nervous to say no. They sat quietly for a moment. Clara kept her eyes on her book, but she could feel him watching her. Finally he spoke. "How are you feeling? After the visit?" "Okay," she said quickly. "Better." "Good," he said, smiling again. "You seemed so nervous last time. I was worried about you." Clara blinked. "Worried? About her?" She didn't know what to say. "I'm fine. Thanks." Ethan leaned back, looking at her like he was trying to figure her out. "You're different, you know. Most people talk a lot or try to impress me. You don't." Clara frowned. "Why would I impress you?" He laughed softly. "Exactly. That's what I like." Her heart skipped. Like, what did that mean? She gripped her coffee cup tighter. He was a millionaire. She was nobody. This didn't make sense. Over the next few weeks, Ethan kept showing up, at the cafe once outside the bookstore. Each time he was kind, asking her simple questions, listening when she spoke. Clara felt a spark, a warmth she couldn't ignore. But she pushed it down. He'd dated fancy women before, she bet, beautiful, rich ones who broke his heart for his money. She wasn't like them. She was real, but she was poor. He'd get bored of her. So she kept her distance, even as his eyes said he wanted more. Clara tried to keep her life simple after meeting Ethan again and again. She worked long hours at the bookstore, skipped meals to save money, and ignored the tired ache in her body. She told herself she was fine. She didn't need a doctor, especially not him. But deep down she knew she was pushing too hard. The discomfort from before was back, worse now, and she felt dizzy sometimes. Still, she wouldn't call Evergreen Women's Clinic. She couldn't face Ethan, not with how confused he made her feel. One evening after a late shift, Clara locked up the bookstore. Her head pounded and her legs felt weak. She stepped onto the dark sidewalk, her bag heavy on her shoulder. The world spun suddenly, lights blurred, her knees gave out and she collapsed. Everything went black. When Clara opened her eyes, she was in a hospital bed. A steady beep came from a machine nearby. Her body felt heavy, but warm sheets covered her. She turned her head and saw him, Dr. Ethan Carter, sitting beside her. His green eyes were wide with worry, his dark hair messy like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked tired, not like the perfect doctor she knew. "Clara," he said, his voice shaky. "You're awake. You scared me." Clara's throat was dry. "What happened?" "You fainted on the street," he said. "Someone called an ambulance. You were sick, high fever, dehydrated. You haven't been taking care of yourself." He leaned closer, his face tight. "When I heard you were here, I came right away." Clara blinked, trying to understand. "You came for her?" She felt small under his gaze. "You didn't have to," she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yes, I did." He paused, then spoke softer. "I care about you, Clara. More than you know." Her chest hurt, not from sickness but from his words. She looked away. "You shouldn't." "Why not?" he asked, his voice sharp now. Clara swallowed hard. Tears stung her eyes. "Because I'm not enough. You're rich, smart, everything. I'm just me. Poor. Scared. I can't be what you want." Ethan went still. Then he took a deep breath and leaned in closer. "You think I've got it all figured out?" "I don't." His voice dropped. "I wasn't always rich. I worked hard, built everything myself. But people, they hurt me. A woman I loved, she didn't want me. She wanted my money. Lied to me for years." Clara's eyes widened. She hadn't expected that. He looked down, his hands clenched. "After that, I stopped trusting. Stopped letting anyone in. Until you." "Me?" she whispered. "Yes, you," he said, meeting her eyes. "You're real, Clara. You don't care about my money. You don't pretend. That's why I want you. Just you." Clara's heart raced. She wanted to believe him, but fear held her back. What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough? Ethan reached out, his hand resting on hers. It was warm, steady. "You're enough. You've always been enough. I don't need anything else." Tears slipped down her cheeks. For the first time she saw him, not the millionaire doctor but a man who hurt like she did. And he saw her too. Not poor Clara but someone worth loving. In that quiet hospital room with his hand on hers, she couldn't run anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she was enough. Clara left the hospital with Ethan's words echoing in her head. "You're enough," he had said, his green eyes steady and sure. She wanted to believe him, but fear held her back. She saw herself as the shy, poor girl who shook in the waiting room of Evergreen Women's Clinic that first day. Ethan was a millionaire doctor. Smart, handsome, successful. They were from different worlds. How could she fit into his? 4 days she stayed quiet, avoiding his calls and texts. Her heart ached, but she didn't know how to let go of her doubts. At home in her tiny apartment, Clara sat on her worn couch, staring at the walls. She thought about her life without Ethan. It felt empty, cold and lonely. She remembered his kindness at the clinic, his smile at the cafe, the way he sat by her hospital bed. He wasn't just a rich man to her anymore. He was Ethan, someone who saw her when no one else did. But could she be brave enough to let him in? She wasn't sure. Days turned into weeks. Ethan didn't push her. He sent a few messages, simple things like, "Hope you're okay," or "Thinking of you," then gave her space. Clara missed him more than she expected. At work, she shelved books with shaky hands. At night, she lay awake, picturing his face. The voice in her head kept whispering she wasn't good enough, but another voice, quieter at first, grew louder. "What if he's right? What if you are enough?" One rainy evening, Clara couldn't take it anymore. She was done running. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her jacket and stepped outside. The streets were wet and busy, people rushing under umbrellas. She didn't care. She needed to see him. She ran through the city, her shoes splashing in puddles, her breath fast. She knew where he'd be, Evergreen Women's Clinic. It was late, but he often worked long hours. She had to tell him how she felt. When Clara burst through the clinic doors, the receptionist looked up, surprised. "We're closing soon," she started, but Clara didn't stop. She hurried down the hall, her wet hair dripping, until she saw him. Ethan stood by his office talking to a nurse. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes widening. "Clara?" he said, stepping forward. She didn't think. She ran to him and threw her arms around him, holding tight. Her face pressed against his chest and she felt his heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her voice shaky. "I was scared. But I don't want to lose you." Ethan froze for a second, then wrapped his arms around her. He held her close like she was the only thing that mattered. "You won't lose me," he said softly. "I'm here." Clara pulled back just enough to look at him. "I thought I wasn't good enough. You're so much more than me, money, everything. But I want this. I want us." Ethan smiled, a real warm smile. "You're all I want, Clara. Nothing else." Time passed, weeks then months. Clara stopped doubting herself so much. Ethan was patient, always there with a kind word or a steady hand. They grew closer, sharing coffee at the cafe, laughing at small things. She still felt shy sometimes, but with him it was okay. She started to feel strong. 1 year later, Ethan took her back to the cafe where they'd met outside the clinic. Clara didn't think much of it, just a normal day. But Ethan seemed nervous, fidgeting with his cup. Then he took her hand, his thumb brushing her skin. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "you changed my life." Before she could answer, he slid off his chair and dropped to one knee. He pulled out a small box with a ring inside. Clara's breath caught. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes full of love. Tears filled her eyes. A year ago, she'd been too shy to even speak to him. Now she knew her answer. "Yes," she said, her voice clear. The cafe cheered, but Clara only heard Ethan. He slipped the ring on her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. She wasn't the scared girl from that first visit anymore. She'd walked into the clinic trembling, afraid of everything. Now she stood tall, loved by a man who saw her worth. Their worlds didn't matter. Rich or poor, they'd chosen each other. And as they held on tight, Clara knew she'd never be alone again.